Nobody's coming to save you. Nobody's coming to cheer you on. And the moment you truly accept that, not as a wound but as a fact, something inside you shifts in a way that changes the entire trajectory of your life. Carl Jung spent decades studying people who built extraordinary inner lives without the safety net of encouragement, validation, or support. And what he found goes against everything modern psychology tells you about the importance of having people in your corner. Jung discovered that some of the most individuated people he ever studied, the ones who'd done the deepest work, who possessed the most unshakable sense of self, weren't people who'd been lifted up by loving communities. They were people who'd been left completely alone, ignored, dismissed, actively undermined by the people who should have been their foundation. And instead of collapsing under that absence, something inside them grew that couldn't have grown any other way. This isn't toxic positivity. This isn't everything happens for a reason. What Jung found was a specific psychological mechanism that activates when external support is permanently withdrawn. A shift in consciousness that most people never experience because they always have just enough validation to keep them dependent on it. And this mechanism, when understood and used correctly, becomes the single most powerful force for building a life that actually belongs to you. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about the psychology of thriving without support, why the absence of encouragement creates something that encouragement never could, the specific traps that destroy people who try to win alone, and how to build the internal architecture that makes external validation irrelevant. Because if no one's supporting you right now, you're not at a disadvantage. You're standing at the entrance to something most people never find. To understand what Jung observed, you need to see what happens inside the psyche when support is absent. Not temporarily, not because someone's busy or distracted, but when the people who are supposed to believe in you, parents, partners, friends, family, either don't care, don't notice, or actively want you to fail. When you look around and there is no one holding space for your growth, no one celebrating your wins, no one saying, "You can do this," when you're terrified. Most psychology frames this as deficit, as something missing that needs to be filled. And there's truth in that. Humans are wired for connection and support. Children need encouragement to develop healthy self-worth. Adults need community to sustain difficult paths. Jung never denied any of this, but he noticed something else. Something the field wasn't talking about because it complicated the narrative. He noticed that patients who'd never had support often developed a quality he couldn't find in patients who had. He described it as an internal authority so complete that it didn't waver regardless of external circumstances. These people didn't need anyone to believe in them because they'd been forced to build belief from the inside out. They hadn't chosen this path. It had been forced on them. But what it produced was psychologically remarkable. Jung would have called this enforced individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming psychologically whole, developing a relationship with your authentic self that doesn't depend on external mirrors. Most people individuate gradually, in fits and starts, with support along the way. But some people are thrown into it violently. Their environment offers nothing, no reflection, no encouragement, no validation. And in that vacuum, either the psyche collapses or it builds its own foundation. The people whose psyches built that foundation became something Jung found genuinely rare. They possessed what he described as self-referencing consciousness. They didn't look outward to determine their value. They didn't need applause to know their work mattered. They didn't require agreement to trust their perception. Their sense of self was generated internally, maintained internally, and validated internally. And this made them almost impossible to manipulate, destabilize, or control. But here's what Jung also found, and this is crucial. This internal authority didn't develop automatically. Plenty of people who grew up without support became bitter, resentful, and psychologically stunted. They didn't develop inner strength. They developed inner wounds that they spent their lives bleeding from. The difference between the ones who collapsed and the ones who built something extraordinary came down to a specific psychological choice that most people don't even know they're making. That choice is the difference between building from resentment and building from sovereignty. And it's the thing that determines whether the absence of support destroys you or transforms you into something unbreakable. Let's talk about resentment first, because this is where most people get trapped. When no one supports you, the natural emotional response is anger, bitterness, a burning desire to prove everyone wrong. And this energy is powerful. It can fuel enormous productivity. People build entire careers on "I'll show them" energy. They achieve things that look impressive from the outside. They accumulate success like ammunition, stockpiling evidence that the people who dismissed them were wrong. Jung observed this pattern extensively, and he was troubled by it, because the people running on resentment were achieving but not living. They were building but not inhabiting what they built. Every accomplishment was oriented toward an audience that wasn't watching: the parent who never cared, the partner who left, the friends who didn't believe. They were performing success for people who would never turn around and validate it. And underneath the achievement was a hollowness that no amount of winning could fill. This is because resentment keeps you psychologically tethered to the people who failed you. When you're building to prove someone wrong, they're still the center of your psychological universe. Your motivation originates from them. Your satisfaction depends on their reaction. Your sense of success is measured against their expectations. You think you've moved past them because you've achieved things they said you couldn't. But psychologically, you're still performing for an empty audience. He saw this as a shadow trap. The shadow isn't just your dark side, it's everything you've refused to integrate. And when someone grows up without support, their shadow often contains enormous grief, abandonment rage, and a desperate hunger for the validation they never received. Instead of facing that grief directly, they convert it into fuel. They use resentment as rocket propellant, and it works, for a while, until the fuel runs out and they're left sitting on top of achievements that feel hollow because they were built for the wrong reason. You've probably experienced some version of this. You work incredibly hard at something, you succeed, and instead of feeling satisfied, you feel empty, because the person you were unconsciously trying to impress still doesn't care. Or worse, they don't even know what you've accomplished. The success was supposed to close the wound, and it didn't. It can't. Because no external achievement can fill an internal absence. Jung was adamant about this. You cannot win your way out of an unmet need for support. You can only grieve it and build something different in its place. So what does building from sovereignty look like? This is what Jung found in the people who actually thrived without support. They weren't fueled by resentment. They weren't trying to prove anything to anyone. They'd done something far more difficult and far more rare. They'd grieved the support they never received. They'd accepted that it wasn't coming. And from that acceptance, they'd shifted the entire orientation of their psychology from external to internal. Building from sovereignty means your motivation comes from alignment with who you actually are, rather than reaction against who failed you. It means the work you do matters to you because it expresses something authentic in you, not because it will make someone regret ignoring you. It means your definition of winning has nothing to do with other people's opinions, and everything to do with whether you're living in integrity with your own values, vision, and sense of purpose. This shift was almost always preceded by a period of profound grief. The sovereign builders had all gone through a phase where they stopped running from the pain of being unsupported and turned to face it directly. They let themselves feel the full weight of what it meant that no one was coming, that the encouragement they'd been waiting for would never arrive, that they were going to have to do this alone, not because they were strong enough, but because there was no other option. This grief looked like failure to people on the outside. It looked like depression, withdrawal, giving up. But Jung recognized it as something profoundly different. It was the psyche releasing its attachment to external validation, letting go of the fantasy that someone would eventually show up and believe in them, accepting that the support they needed would have to be built from within, or it wouldn't exist at all. And on the other side of that grief, something emerged that resentment could never produce. A quietness, a certainty that didn't need anyone else's agreement, a motivation that came from such a deep place inside that external circumstances couldn't touch it. These people didn't work hard because they were trying to prove something. They worked hard because the work itself was an expression of who they were. The audience was irrelevant. The applause was unnecessary. The validation was already present, generated internally, sustained internally. This is what it actually means to win in life when no one supports you. It doesn't mean achieving so much that people are forced to notice. It doesn't mean becoming so successful that everyone regrets doubting you. It means building an internal relationship with yourself that's so solid, so honest, so deeply rooted in who you actually are, that the presence or absence of external support becomes irrelevant to your ability to move forward. But getting there requires navigating specific psychological dangers that Jung mapped out carefully. Because the path from unsupported to sovereign is full of traps that can swallow you whole if you don't see them coming. The first trap is what Jung would have called the proving wound. This is the unconscious belief that if you just achieve enough, the people who didn't support you will finally see your worth. The proving wound keeps you oriented toward an external audience, even when you think you've let go of needing approval. It disguises itself as ambition, as drive, as healthy motivation. But underneath, it's still the child performing for a parent who isn't watching. You recognize the proving wound when success feels urgent rather than fulfilling, when rest feels dangerous because someone might pass you, when you can't celebrate an achievement because you're already anxious about the next one, when your entire sense of value rises and falls with your productivity. This isn't ambition. This is a wound wearing ambition's clothing, and until you see it for what it is, every accomplishment will feel like it's not quite enough, because it's trying to fill a hole that achievement can't reach. The second trap is isolation disguised as independence. When no one supports you, there's a temptation to decide you don't need anyone, to build walls so high that nothing can hurt you, but also nothing can reach you. Jung was clear that individuation is not isolation. Becoming whole doesn't mean becoming alone. The people who thrived without support didn't reject connection entirely. They became selective about it. They learned to distinguish between people who could actually see them and people who couldn't. And they invested only in connections where genuine reciprocity was possible. If you've built walls and called them boundaries, if you've confused self-protection with self-sufficiency, if you've decided that needing people is weakness, that's not sovereignty. That's the wound talking. The wound says nobody can be trusted because the first people who should have been trustworthy weren't. But Jung found that sovereign individuals eventually opened again, carefully, selectively, with full awareness of who deserved access and who didn't. Closing off completely isn't winning. It's just losing in a way that feels like control. The third trap is bitterness masquerading as wisdom. After years of being unsupported, it's easy to develop a worldview that frames self-reliance as virtue and trust as naivety. You start seeing everyone who has support as lucky or soft. You develop contempt for people who need encouragement. You tell yourself you're realistic while actually becoming cynical. And this cynicism feels like strength because it protects you from disappointment. But Jung would have recognized it as shadow projection, turning your unprocessed grief about not being supported into judgment of people who are. If you find yourself dismissing people who have supportive families, if you feel contempt when someone talks about their partner encouraging them, if you tell yourself that needing support is a weakness you've transcended, pay attention. That's not transcendence. That's resentment wearing a mask. Real sovereignty doesn't need to diminish what others have. It's secure enough to acknowledge that support is valuable while also knowing you can build without it. And if any of this is resonating, if you're recognizing patterns you've been running without realizing it, that recognition itself is the beginning of building from the inside out. That's exactly the kind of inner work that true self-discovery was designed for. 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, built to help you see the wounds you've been building on top of, so you can start building on something solid instead. You'll find the link below. Because once you see the traps, you can start doing what Jung found the sovereign builders actually did. The practices that turned absence of support into presence of self. The psychological work that transformed being unsupported from a curse into the unlikely foundation of an unshakable life. The first practice Jung identified was what he called self-witnessing. Most people develop their sense of identity through being witnessed by others. Someone sees your effort, acknowledges your pain, celebrates your growth. And through their witness, you know you're real. But when no one witnesses you, identity becomes unstable. You start doubting your own experience. Did that really happen? Was that actually hard? Am I actually good at this? Without external confirmation, the mind begins to question everything. Self-witnessing is the deliberate practice of becoming your own observer, not your own cheerleader. Jung wasn't interested in affirmations or self-hype. Self-witnessing means developing the capacity to accurately perceive your own experience without needing someone else to validate it. You did something difficult. You know it was difficult. You don't need anyone else to confirm that. You experienced pain. You know it was real. You don't need anyone else to acknowledge it. This sounds simple, but it's extraordinarily hard when you've been conditioned to outsource perception. When your entire childhood taught you that your experiences weren't real unless someone else confirmed them. When you've spent years minimizing your own struggle because no one was there to say, yes, that was hard. Self-witnessing means reclaiming your own authority over your experience, trusting your perception, validating your own difficulty without waiting for permission to feel it. The second practice was what Jung described as building an internal council. He didn't mean this metaphorically. Jung observed that psychologically healthy people had internalized voices of wisdom, challenge, comfort, and truth. Not the critical inner voices that come from unprocessed trauma. Those are introjects, fragments of abusive or neglectful figures that got stuck inside. An internal counsel is deliberately cultivated. It might include the voice of a teacher who once believed in you, the imagined voice of a wise elder, the voice of your own future self who's already been through what you're facing now. Jung worked with patients to develop these internal resources because he recognized that people without external support needed to be able to access guidance, encouragement, and honest reflection from within. This wasn't delusion, it was psychological architecture, building internal structures that performed the functions that external relationships would normally perform. Not as a permanent replacement for human connection, but as a foundation that allowed someone to keep moving when no one else was holding them up. The third practice was ruthless honesty about motivation. Jung found that the sovereign builders were brutally honest with themselves about why they were doing what they were doing. Before any major effort, they'd interrogate their own motivation. Am I doing this because it matters to me, or because I'm trying to prove something? Is this aligned with who I actually am, or is this a performance for an audience that doesn't exist? Am I building from desire or from resentment? This interrogation wasn't paralyzing, it was clarifying. Because when you strip away the resentment motivation, the proving motivation, the look at me now motivation, what's left is pure. It's the thing you do even if no one ever knew you did it. It's the work that matters to you in a room by yourself at 3 in the morning, with no audience and no reward. That's the work that builds a life. Everything else builds a performance. The fourth practice was strategic patience. Jung observed that people without support often developed an urgent, frantic quality to their ambition. Because they had no safety net, every setback felt existential. Because no one was encouraging them, they needed results to prove to themselves that they were on the right path. This urgency made them impulsive, reactive, and prone to burning out on things that weren't aligned with their deeper purpose. Strategic patience meant trusting the process even when there was no one to remind you that things take time. It meant being able to sit in the discomfort of not yet there without panicking. It meant understanding that meaningful work unfolds on its own timeline, and that urgency driven by fear of abandonment isn't the same thing as healthy drive. The sovereign builders moved with purpose but without panic. They worked steadily but without desperation. Because their motivation was internal, they weren't racing against the clock of someone else's attention span. Jung also found something remarkable about the people who successfully built from sovereignty rather than resentment. They eventually attracted a different kind of support. Not the support they'd craved as children, unconditional, automatic, always present, but something more selective, more mature, and in many ways more valuable. People who were drawn to the quality of what they'd built. People who recognized the internal solidity and were attracted to it. People who supported them not out of obligation or pity, but out of genuine respect for what they'd become. This is one of the great paradoxes Jung observed. The people who stopped needing support often received it. Not because the universe rewards self-sufficiency, that's magical thinking, but because the psychological transformation that occurs when you stop performing for validation and start building from authenticity changes what you project into the world. You become someone worth supporting, not because you need it, but because what you're building is real, and others can sense that realness. But Jung warned against chasing this outcome. The moment you start building from sovereignty in order to attract support, you've already fallen back into the proving trap. The support arrives as a byproduct, never as a goal. The goal is the internal architecture. The goal is becoming someone whose sense of self doesn't fluctuate based on who's in the audience. The goal is building a life that's meaningful to you in total silence, and then letting whatever response comes, come. There's one more thing Jung observed about the people who won without support, and it might be the most important thing. They eventually stopped defining winning the way the world defined it. External success, money, status, recognition, achievement, those things might come, and they're not bad. But the sovereign builders eventually realized that the deepest form of winning was internal. It was waking up without the ache of needing someone to notice. It was working on something meaningful without checking if anyone was watching. It was sitting in stillness and feeling complete rather than empty. This kind of winning is invisible to the outside world. Nobody throws a parade for the person who finally stopped needing applause. Nobody celebrates the moment you grieve the support you never got and release the fantasy that it's coming. Nobody sees the internal shift from resentment to sovereignty because it happens in the quietest part of you. But Jung recognized it as the most profound victory a human being could achieve. To need nothing from the outside in order to be whole on the inside. To build from truth rather than from wound. To move through the world with the kind of quiet certainty that can only come from having built your own foundation when no one else would. If no one's supporting you right now, this is what's available to you. Not a consolation prize, not making the best of a bad situation. An actual psychological transformation that people with endless support rarely access because they never have to. The absence of external validation forces you into a confrontation with yourself that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. It strips away every false source of worth and demands that you build something real from the inside. And what gets built in that crucible, that internal authority, that self-generated purpose, that quiet, unshakable knowing of who you are, cannot be taken from you by anyone, because no one gave it to you in the first place. Jung spent his career documenting the human capacity for transformation under impossible conditions. He found that the psyche, when pushed to its absolute limit, has resources that most people never discover because they're never forced to look for them. The people who built lives without support didn't do it because they were naturally stronger or more resilient. They did it because they had no choice but to look inward, and when they did, they found something there that was worth building on. That something is in you too, not as potential, not as something you need to develop. It's already there, underneath the grief and the resentment and the exhaustion of doing everything alone. It's been there your whole life, waiting for you to stop looking outward for what can only be found within. You don't need permission to build your life. You don't need an audience to validate your direction. You don't need someone to believe in you before you're allowed to believe in yourself. The support you've been waiting for exists. It just doesn't live where you've been looking for it. It lives in the part of you that's kept going despite every reason to stop. The part that's still here, still trying, still reaching for something even when no one's reaching back. That's not weakness. That's the raw material of everything Jung meant when he talked about becoming who you actually are. And if you're ready to stop building for an audience that isn't watching and start building for the person who's been here all along, that shift, quiet, invisible, yours alone, is the real victory. Not someday, now, in the silence, in the absence, in the space where no one's supporting you and you decide to show up for yourself anyway. That's how you win when no one's in your corner. Not by fighting harder, by finally turning inward and discovering that the corner was never empty. You just hadn't looked closely enough at who was already standing in it. If that resonated with something you've been carrying, if you're ready to stop building on resentment and start building on something real, true self-discovery was made for exactly where you are right now. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed to help you find your way within. The link is right below.